Thank you, everyone, and welcome to the Trauma Interest Work Group's Perspectives on Safety series for this academic year. I'm Dorian Miller. I'm going to be your facilitator today. I'm a professor of medicine in the Biological Sciences Division at University of Chicago, and we have a number of our members that are here in the audience as part of our lead group. I'd like to thank our panelists for joining us today, and I'm going to do longer introductions in just a moment. But wanted to make sure that I both provided them with thanks, as well as thanking our academic sponsor for this series and for the Trauma Interest Work Group, the Mansueto Institute for Urban Innovation. We've got a housekeeping slide here that's on the screen. We've got about, looks like, oh my goodness, 25 people that are on Zoom for this particular talk, which is absolutely wonderful, in addition to the people who are in the room. And so we're very happy to see such great interest in the talk today. In terms of housekeeping for people who are on Zoom, please mute yourselves. Please use the raised hand function in the chat. And then also, if you're interested in signing up for future events, details will be coming around that. When we get to the audience Q&A portion, because we have people that are working with us or meeting with us on Zoom, just please make sure that you raise your voices to make sure that they can hear you. And Heidi will give us a sign, or we'll give you a sign if there's an issue with people not being able to hear that are on Zoom. Thanks. Our discussion today will focus on the meaning of safety for individuals, families, and communities after they've suffered violence. How does the process of grieving and sense-making after violence affect how people experience the world that they move through and seek to improve? How do competing understandings of safety shape the city we share? So a little bit of background about our panelists. Our first panelist is Professor Adam Green. He's the associate professor in the New Department of Race, Diaspora, and Indigenous, also in the Department of History in the College at the University of Chicago. He teaches American history and the history of Black Chicago. He's the author of Selling the Race, Culture, Community, and Black Chicago, 1940 to 1955, and co-editor of Time Longer Than Rope, A Century of African American Activism. Adam has lectured extensively before city agencies, community audiences, and leadership forums on a variety of topics, including community wellness. He and Jamie Kalven serve as co-chairs of the Council on University Community Relations. Our second panelist is Jamie Kalven, who's the writer and founder of the Invisible Institute. He's the author of Working with Available Light, A Family's World After Violence, and the editor of A Worthy Tradition, Freedom of Speech in America, by his father, Harry Kalven Jr. He has reported extensively on patterns of police abuse and impunity, and he was the plaintiff in Kalven versus Chicago, in which the Illinois Appellate Court ruled that documents bearing on allegations of police misconduct are public information. His reporting first brought the police shooting of Laquan McDonald to public attention, and he co-produced 16 Shots, an Emmy Award-winning documentary on the McDonald case. His 2016 series, Code of Silence in The Intercept, exposed the criminal activities of a team of corrupt Chicago officers operating in public housing, and has contributed to the exonerations of 183 individuals. Among the national awards he's received include the 2015 George Polk Award for Local Programming, the 2016 Ridenour Courage Prize, the 2017 Hilton Prize for Web Journalism, and the I.F. Stone Medal for Journalistic Independence. The Invisible Institute received a 2021 Pulitzer Prize. Our last presenter today is Tre Nowaczynski. Tre is a trauma-informed clinician and social worker with demonstrated experience working with youth and families in the aftermath of community violence. Building on a facilitator skill set developed through experience with working with youth in St. Paul and Minneapolis public schools, Tre began his clinical study at the intersection of gun violence, under-resourced neighborhoods, and innovative interventions in collaboration with organizations such as I Grow Chicago, BBF Family Services, and the Inclusive Economy Lab with the University of Chicago. Starting his social work career with Healing Hurt People Chicago, Tre spent time serving individuals in their supportive systems and identifying skills, goals, and safety plans throughout their recovery through traumatic injury. bridging connections between the University of Chicago's Crown Family School of Social Work Policy and Program. As a field education assistant, Tre is well versed in the social service landscape across the greater metropolitan Chicago area. With a passion for youth advocacy, Tre is a pediatric specialist in the Violence Recovery Program and aims to serve patients and their families through an abolitionist trauma-informed lens. And so let's give a little bit of a round of applause for our guest today. Thank you. The first question that I have is going to be focused on Adam and Jamie, and I have a few questions that I'll be asking, but we also welcome your questions after I finish the questions that I have designed for our guest today. Adam and Jamie, both of you serve as co-chairs on the University of Chicago Community Relations Historical, Contemporary, and Future Committee. How does the conversation on safety come into play as you think about university community relations? And Adam, I'll start with you and then I'll go to Jamie.
Thank you. Well, first, thank you to Dorian and everyone for the opportunity to come and speak in this forum. It's something that I think, in relation to this council, understanding the ways in which both, we want to try to convene and move conversations forward, but we want to learn about how to understand the university as an institution, as a community, its relationship to communities all around the South Side and indeed within the city. So this is a particularly exciting opportunity and I'm grateful for the chance to do it. The council, as Dorian said, is charged with, really for the first time, looking at the university's relationship to surrounding communities historically, understanding the different sorts of ways in which its footprint and extension of activities impacts communities in positive ways and in negative ways at the present moment, and what might be ways of kind of imagining better practices in the future. And I think straight away, safety is one of the most important terms to try to unpack and inform and try to broker and convene better and fuller conversations between the university as an institution, the university as a campus community, and surrounding communities. Because safety informs so much of the way in which the university historically has thought about its interests. Panics, for instance, about crime, street crime in the 1950s were a primary driver of the university engaging in clearing and relocation activities of families, particularly along Cottage Grove and Lake Park, and creating, in a certain sense, a kind of remade area of Hyde Park that was primarily populated and driven by the university. Understanding its particular interests. The university had forces working a sense of the campus apart from the South Side. And there are all sorts of attitudes and perspectives and postures that are taken by faculty members like myself, students, institutional leaders in terms of imagining a university interest that's partable from the community. But a perspective on safety from our side, I think, my side certainly, is that there's no way to imagine an understanding of community or public safety for the university without recognizing all of the ways in which community members' sense of safety determines the environment, the kind of perspectives, but really also the possibilities in terms of the future around how the university operates. And so the council is really trying to figure out different sorts of ways through research, through inquiry, in time, through convenings that will be public in forums like this one, how to break through, as it were, that fourth wall in which the university can imagine that it can understand its interests apart from the interests of the city, the South Side, the neighborhoods that are around it, and the history. Talk more as we go further into what that looks like. But safety is very, very critical to this, because safety, I think, has been such an effective language of being able to enforce divisions and a kind of sense of apartness in terms of the university's interest from a general public and community interest.
Great, thank you. Jamie, your perspectives?
Yeah, so that's a very helpful framing of how the council sort of sees its work. To step back still further, I mean, I think you could look at the history of Chicago, the way the city is structured through a lens of a history of violence and people's aspirations for safety and to feel at home in. And so it's a rich and at the same time elusive perspective, insofar as I think we're all kind of inside a paradigm that it's hard to step back and get perspective on. And I think part of the aspiration of the council is really descriptive, to be able to create perspectives that don't currently exist. The way in which we envision doing that is to actually, and Adam was evoking this, to create spaces, occasions, and a spirit of hospitality to have conversations that don't effectively take place, and to the extent that they occasionally don't really advance and mature in universities' interaction with the multiple communities around it. So we're looking to establish a kind of practice in how certain questions are framed and pursued and inquired into. And, Dorian described in the framing of this conversation, this notion of sort of sense making after violence, right? Which everybody does at some level. A kid who's been shot in a neighborhood conflict and is looking to somehow restore order and make sense of things, and seizes on revenge as a way that's going to somehow restore and that's sense making. That's sense making. University actors who become anxious about faculty and students coming in light of perceptions of the neighborhood being, that's another mode of sense making. Individuals who, and I've been privileged to witness this on more than one occasion, who after violence, instead of contracting their human sympathies, expand them and have access to sympathetic imagination for what other people's lives might be like based on their own traumatic experience. That's sense making. What we don't engage in much, and certainly from within the university and from the university's perspective, is a conversation on a kind of equal footing where we compare our experience of the world and share together. And so one of the major aspirations of the council is to, in all sorts of ways, and we're constantly brainstorming about this, is to create those occasions and to create those spaces and to make them genuinely hospitable, as I said, a conversation people want to join.
Thank you. The next question is for Tre, and Jamie, I might ask you to chime in on this a little bit because I think there's a nice segue there. Tre, what does safety feel like for community members?
Yeah.
Reflecting on your work.
Yeah, I definitely want to thank everybody for coming today and for inviting me to be part of this panel. I think my perspective is a little bit different, so I will speak directly from my work at the University Medical Center here. When we're thinking about safety, when it comes to patients who've been affected by community violence directly, or their family members have been victimized by gun violence, we're really seeing that a sense of belonging is kind of the primary intervention that we're looking to engage. So when I say sense of belonging, I mean, do I live in a community that has reliable resources? Do I feel like I have a sense of calm? Is there a reduced sense of anxiety? And ultimately, when I go home, do I know that this is not going to happen to me again? And if that is the case, how might I respond to the fact that I was injured in my own community? We often see that there are folks who decide that they want to relocate after an injury, they want to leave the communities that they're a part of. We even see a high level of investment in like ourselves partaking in the removal of individuals from communities so that they might feel safe in another community. But ultimately, that is about eliminating, mitigating, or more or less moving around these risk factors that continue to allow people to be victimized in this way. So it comes down to building a sense of trust. I think that is really what safety feels like. And when that trust is not there, it's because of a lack of all those other things, a lack of reliable resources. I don't trust my neighbors, or I don't feel like my neighbors are watching out for me in this way. And when you lose those kinds of strong social bonds, that strong social network, you begin to see yourself alienated, isolated, and alone, really, truly in community. And unfortunately, being victimized by violence can drive you, I think where Jamie's saying some people are able to expand into a sense of what others might be feeling. A lot of folks will retract. They remove themselves from community, their interpersonal relationships deteriorate, they spend less time kind of trying to build that kind of network of safety and support, and then ultimately find themselves wanting to leave the communities that, you know, their families and otherwise have been a part of their whole lives.
Yeah, so I wholly agree with that formulation, and I'm remembering that some of the people I've interviewed about their experience of violence have described it as being ripped out of the world. You know, just sort of being you might be alone, but you're, you know, connected to all the people in your life, the things you care about, and then violence intervenes, and it's so radically isolating. So I think in the aftermath of violence, as Tre was saying, figuring out, and it's not just resuming the life you had before, you know, it's the terms of existence have been changed by the violent act, whatever form it's taken. So how to kind of reintegrate and even remap the world in light of this thing you've come to know. You know, one victim of violence once said to me, there's knowing and there's knowing. You know, of course, we all know that violence is traumatic and disruptive in people's lives. But then there's knowing, you know, when you directly experienced. And it's quite a project to reimagine your life and your place in the world in light of that. To Tre's point and to Dorian's question about how people experience safety in community, in my experience, it's wholly a matter of relationships. But I would add that can take a lot of forms. You know, as Dorian's introduction suggested, I've spent a lot of time writing about police abuse and impunity. And particularly, I've spent a number of years working with, you know, sort of the street organizations in public housing when the high rises were up on South State Street. And one form the safety can take in a community where you don't trust civil authority, where you don't trust the police, is to actually join the street organizations as a way of, as a wholly defensive thing. You know, I was around in public housing long enough that little boys that used to climb in my lap and want to ride in the back of my truck, you know, at 12, 13, begin to become affiliated with the gangs. There's not a one that I would say was motivated by, you know, wanting to be a menace to society. It was all about being safe. It was all about being safe. And so there's also that dynamic with, you know, with other powers outside the community and in many communities that is embodied by the police. That's the face of government. See, that interaction affects people's sense of safety tremendously.
I was thinking about back in the day when children were introduced to the police department through an officer-friendly program, and how different the viewpoints are now, particularly for Black and Brown youth, given their experiences.
Well, and I would say just quickly on that, you know, there are some officer friendlies out there. I deal with police officers all the time in my reporting, and there's some wholly admirable people, conducting themselves just as we would want them to. And they exemplify the best possibilities of law enforcement. But if you have failures of accountability, and there's that crew of officers that come around every day on third watch and do their dirt, whatever form that takes, and they're not held accountable, they actually become the real police. And officer friendly, may in fact be there, but what I think fail to understand is when we don't hold bad actors accountable, they're experienced as being somehow sanctioned by authority, and that's kind of what oppression feels like.
Yeah, Trey, I was struck by your comments just a moment ago regarding the sense of isolation that people experience after they have had an encounter with violent trauma. How does that blend into relationships with police for people who've experienced it?
Yeah, certainly. I think, as Jamie's saying here, when the police are an individual's first and maybe only interaction with the state, and you have bad actors who consistently demonstrate to you, maybe not directly, but at least within your community, that they're not keeping you safe, and that they're in fact causing more harm than they're doing good. It kind of, again, alienates you from all of the other state institutions that could potentially either provide support or a sense of belonging. And I think that the further that you get alienated from any of these kinds of support, so if we're talking about lacking social bonds directly in your community, ideally your next point of contact is going to be your school or your local community organization, things of that nature. And when the state kind of is oppressive and does take away your sense of safety for yourself, whatever act of violence that's happened to you, be it structural, be it interpersonal, it creates a bigger gap, a void between what we can do to bring those back together. I think more than anything, of negative interactions within your community. It's officer friendly and these like meet and greets at schools, but when you're really seeing people do their job and commit harm, it's hard to think back to these moments when you were in, I don't know, I think I was in second or third grade the first time an officer came to my classroom. And that was my only interaction with police until I got a little bit older and I started to see that wasn't a true iteration of what they were being asked to do within my community.
Thank you. Adam, you had some thoughts on that as well?
I just want to make one point, I think sort of working off of both Trey and Jamie, which is that also the very job of what it means to police has changed and been changed so profoundly over the last 40, 50 years that one has to think about whether or not there's always room in a certain sense to think about community well-being. I mean, in this capacity of talking with other groups, particularly some of these leadership forums, I was doing one 2 weeks ago, we were talking about the Austin community neighborhood and talking about the quality of life report that LISC with MacArthur and other groups had kind of brought from it, along with, I think, 25, 27 other community reports. And one of the elements that was generated from this community report by the set of actors within it talking about the community is that there are $24 million blocks within Austin. $1 million blocks is the rubric that's used to say that it cost $1 million on that block to incarcerate residents who were formerly living there, most of them Black, most of them poor, many of them within the sort of state system. And just the way in which policing has been the gateway to incarceration. It's not that people weren't jailed. I mean, many of the street organizations in Chicago started at youth reformatories downstate in the 1950s and 1960s, but the degree and the impact and what it means to kind of extract people over 10, 15, sometimes 30, 40 years from communities. The loss of income that comes from people not working in those communities, the loss of effective ties in the ways in which we're talking about here. That existed before, but it's changed to an order of magnitude over the last 30 or 40 years. And so I kind of feel like that reminds us, as well as the cut of all sorts of other social welfare services, to the point where the police budget is what it is in a city like Chicago, because it's a kind of one-stop shop for servicing within these communities. If there's a domestic dispute, the police intervene. If there's a problem in relation to a child and a parent, the police intervene. And escalation too often is what comes out of that, rather than de-escalation and healing. And it just feels to me, not as somebody who practices with this every day, but as a historian, that it's important to mark that, because it means that people have to do a very different job than the one ideally perhaps than was conceived in relation to what some people call a peace officer, in terms of referring to the police. It's hard to keep the peace when what you're trying to do is move people on a conveyor to some place in which they can be remanded and processed in a very, very different space than the neighborhoods that they might properly belong within.
You know, we've talked a bit about neighborhoods, and I think that Adam, you're leading us into my next question, and that is the position, the intersectionality of identity in terms of race, ethnicity, gender, poverty. All of these things come into play. How do they come into play in terms of the experience of not only oppression, but the grief process? Ray, I'm going to turn to you with that first, and then Adam, I'll come back to you for a response.
Yeah, certainly. We do witness a lot of this grief process in the hospital and with this work. And I find that even the ability to grieve is something that is surveilled, particularly at this university, at this hospital. I find that a number of the practices and protocols that we have within our emergency department kind of create scenarios where that positionality and those intersections of self are really, they really come to the fore in ways that I don't even expect that community members anticipate when they arrive to the hospital. So for instance, we go on external lockdown procedure when we have traumas come to the hospital, which means there's UCPD outside of our emergency department so that no visitors can come in. You can only come into our emergency department if you have an injury. So family members who are arriving to see other ones who've been hurt are turned around at the door. UCPD officers don't have information because they're not hospital staff. So now you have this additional layer of surveillance where I know that my loved one is injured. I'm already starting this grieving process without a ton of information. And when I arrive, I'm turned around by a peace officer who is now, watching all of my actions. How am I responding to this no? How am I responding to this grief that's building and this anxiety now that's growing because I don't have answers? The next layer is, a weapons detection system in front of our emergency department. It was created as a way to mitigate workplace violence, but ultimately I think that's a conversation that is more impactful to the communities of people that are coming to our hospital. So now I'm going through a weapons detection system, or even if I see it, I have another a sense of, am I wanted here? Is there a reason why I might be being perceived as an active threat in this hospital when I'm just coming to see my loved one? I'm just coming to receive care. And then, the other parts of this, which are institutional in nature, but also somewhat protective, where it's like HIPAA laws, right? Where we can only provide information to next of kin. So if I'm cousin, brother, girlfriend, otherwise not next of kin, I can't get this information. I'm again experiencing this anxiety. Now I'm in this public forum where other people are seeing me, they're witnessing how I'm responding, and my grief can't be held by an institution that refuses to see me for all the parts that I am.
Yeah.
Adam, your reflections on that.
Well, I mean, it's really, really powerful. I kind of feel like we want to make an appointment and sort of talk through that process in relation to the trauma center, because part of it feels to me is like separating the process of a family gathering from the process of protection in a general sense. So the various kinds of weapon detection systems that you were speaking of, Tre, but also, and I've heard this in many different contexts, the ways in which the aftermath of a situation of violence gets wound up and even kind of superseded by the imperatives of investigation. So everybody is potentially suspect because everybody potentially can provide information to an open case. And, you know, the ways in which there might be manipulation in terms of the grieving and the emotions of that moment in that, I think just probably compounds some of the dynamics that you're talking about, Trey. To me, I think the way that intersections come in most powerfully and sort of recognizing and appreciating that people come with many different orientations, many different facets, what we think of as a kind of intersectional architecture to their person in history. It reminds us that often we speak about a victim in an instance of violence, but we are actually speaking about many survivors. And we have to think about the ways in which, or we have to become better equipped to speak about the ways in which this is holistic, this is collective, this is communal, this is relational. And if we don't grasp that on just a victim or focus on, you know, just some way of addressing the harm that's often kind of pushed over for an institution or a government or a police force or a set of media interpreters to say, we're going to make a testimony about making everybody safe now or making particular people safe now. I think meaning making after violence requires really thinking about the ways in which it's a collective response and a collective interest. And I suppose that starts first with appreciating that kin, friends, young friends who might come to someone who's in a street organization or a gang and want to stand with them, they shouldn't be sort of have reinforced to them that they're first and foremost a criminal in the eye of the hospital or the eye of the university or the eye of the police. And yet that's often what happens. Maybe part of what needs to be flipped is recognizing in simply kind of imagining that victim as someone who needs to be avenged, I guess, by the state rather than by their peers. But instead, thinking about the ways in which that's a situation in which survivors all need to be gathered and brought together in a restorative way to imagine what would be health and well-being coming out of the fact of that instance of violence taking place. So to me, and I mean, I apologize for being fairly general. That says something about the ways in which I'm at a distance from this on an everyday. But for me, a very simple turn is to say that this is something that actually incorporates everyone who has some connection to that experience. And everyone needs to be part of the process of imagining what healing and restoration would be. You know, both for the person who directly was impacted by it, but all the other people that draw the collateral costs of that as well.
Jamie, please.
Yeah, and I think that's a huge opportunity, to put it in affirmative terms. That's a huge opportunity. I'm thinking of what Trey said earlier about the radical isolation of violence, the sense of being ripped out of the world. You know, one image is that, you know, if we're members one of another, you know, as the Bible would have it, violence is dismembering. It's dismembering. So that reintegration is just hugely important. And we have a language of community trauma, but I'm not sure it, and you guys are the experts. I mean, you know, in terms of working daily with trauma, but I'm not sure that term captures what Adam was evoking quite, you know, that there really is this way in which a single violent act, you know, inflicted on a particular individual pulses through a network of relationships. And, you know, that's almost, you know, you almost have vertigo having that perception when you think about how much violence there is in the world. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, I think what Adam was bringing into view was the affirmative possibility of working with that dynamic.
Yeah. And I mean, just to underscore something I feel like, Trey, that you brought up, it requires institutionally, which is one of the reasons why I think we would want to think about this and will think about this within the council. It requires appreciating the quality and the value of those relationships in order to do good work around healing as you start. You don't, begin with the given that there are guns all over the place and people want to harm each other and these kids are out of control and so on and so forth. You start with appreciating that there's something of value in the room, which I'm sure, you could speak on tremendously. And each and every time, one of the things probably that we, the university, the hospital, all of the trauma center has to do is appreciate the value of that each and every time it's convened before us. And I think that's the opportunity that you're talking about, Jen.
When I first became interested in this area, and this is going back maybe 20 years ago, I learned about the work of Dr. Gary Slutkin when he brought ceasefire and cure violence to Chicago and based it on a model of epidemiology of interrupting an epidemic. And as opposed to thinking of it as an infectious disease, which is the area that he'd been trained in, that it was the question of interruption and how things spread. But one of the things I'm hearing here is that you're saying, let's flip the script on it. Let's figure out a way to turn it into an asset in terms of being able to not only build community, but build community through healing. Is that a correct interpretation?
I think that's good. And I think, Trey made reference earlier to processes of grief that derail, that don't go to full sort of maturity and don't advance, which certainly happens a lot in the world. But when grief runs true, it's a deeply creative process. I actually think much of our sort of cultural making is in response to loss.
Yeah, that's right.
And right, I mean, and so there's this well of creativity there that I think we could be much more skilled and sort of refined in the way we work with it.
Interesting. Very
Yeah.
interesting.
If I can add to that, I think like if we're thinking about violence as something that dismembers us, both wholly and from our communities, this effort, at least in this, for us clinically who work with trauma, is this act of remembering, right? Like both what assets and strengths we have and hold are already, like what are our resources that we already hold, and what have we forgotten? What are the things that we've come away from that either did keep us safe previously, either did help us maintain these strong social bonds, but ultimately I think it's important to think about gun violence as an epidemic, to think about it from this public health lens, because we know that if we're looking at like gun violence from a social contagion model, right? You're more likely to be victimized by violence if you have one degree of association from somebody who has been affected by violence. So I think you're absolutely right, Dr. Green, that it is impactful to more than just the individual. And if we're not starting to think about healing that whole system, we're not ever going to be able to move forward from this moment in time that we have.
Thank you. I want to do a time check because I suspect that there are probably some questions that are brewing in the audience to see how much time we have. We have 20 minutes. I got a couple of other questions that may come up a little bit later, but I want to give people both on Zoom as well as people who are here live the opportunity to ask questions and to get engaged in the conversation. And so I'll stop with the prepared questions that I have here and introduce people who are here and on Zoom into the conversation. So Heidi, if you could remind folks on Zoom to drop their questions into the chat and then to ask people to raise their hands with questions or comments.
There was a question actually. Mavis, if you want to unmute yourself to ask your question, I know you had your hand raised online.
Yeah, so in thinking about grief and grieving versus self-pity, when does grief become self-pity? Because sometimes, especially a woman, I'm being a woman, the grief process can be completed, and then grieving that continues beyond that is a kind of self-pity that is can be a form of passive aggressive, which I think gun violence is related to. And I think police mistreatment or perception of a woman, especially, as being self-pitying or passive aggressive or undisclosing, has led to some of the violence against women, maybe other races, besides mine. But I think it's an issue that some of the gun violence is expressing towards what looks like a grief process that really is self-pity.
Thank you for your question, Mavis. Trey, I'm gonna direct that one to you.
Yeah, I think grief is complicated, right? Grief is already a complicated process. There is not any right or wrong way to move through grief, but grief is also associated with really, really difficult emotions, shame, guilt. These kinds of things are not always things that we can do on our own, right? So if we're thinking about grief turning into self-pity and creating some of this isolation that I keep referring to, I think it's a matter of being able to surround that grief with other resources. You know, how are we imagining your grief process moving forward when we're engaging patients, families in the hospital? You know, we're tending to these questions, and we have such a limited time frame to interact with families, but ultimately we're trying to prepare them for what might happen. You know, you might go home, and while you feel safe in the hospital, in your community is where you feel least safe. So now you're having a difficult time walking down the street without looking over your shoulder. You're having a difficult time opening up. You're dissociating in school. Like, depending on what your context is and what other resources you've already named for yourself, that self-pity can for sure carry. But, you know, ultimately, after these major traumatic incidences, it's even more critical that we're supporting individuals while they navigate their grief, and hopefully can move away from some of those really negative emotions that are painful to deal with on your own.
You know, I would add that I can certainly imagine situations where grief would sort of mutate into self-pity. But I think it's also important to recognize that for different individuals, grief has its own pace, you know, its own unfolding. And often that's a lot longer than the individual would want, or that people around her or him have patience for. So just sort of understanding the kind of long lastingness of violence. And again, to your term, flipping the script and seeing that as an opportunity for interventions rather than pathologizing it.
Adam, please.
Just really quickly, I'm going to be taking part in a different event, which I actually want to put up here because it seems very relevant to this. March 28th, Paula Giddings, the historian who wrote a biography of Ida B. Wells, is going to be coming, and as part of the larger university forum on freedom of expression, there's going to be a dialogue that I'm going to have with her. And I'm going through her book, and I'm reading actually about Ida B. Wells's response to the triple lynching of a very close friend and two other associates from an enterprise, the People's Grocer in Memphis in March of 1892. And Wells had written somewhat tangentially, she would become absolutely a lead voice and analyst about lynching and the way that you were bringing up, the kind of defamation of Black womanhood, the defamation of Black manhood, the bizarre, twisted ways in which the defense of white womanhood justified and validated mob and mass violence throughout the South during the 1890s and beyond, that all of that she was processing, and she was at the kind of point of when this took place. But the reason why she comes to mind right now is that immediately after, this was a close friend of hers who was shot, his body was unrecognizable after the crime. She advocated for people to move out of Memphis, and then in order to be responsible, to kind of serve her role as a journalist, she actually traveled to Oklahoma and Kansas to review conditions and come back and report whether it made sense for people to go there, who they could actually engage with. And the reason why this comes to mind to me is that the self-pity that the caller was speaking about, I think at times is about internalizing this very overwhelming sense of responsibility. I should have protected myself. I should have protected my loved one. And that may be part of what we around, in terms of thinking about the kind of support we can provide, is how can you more healthy senses of responsibility. And it strikes me that Ida B. Wells, somebody who certainly went through a huge amount of trauma over the course of her life, actually exemplified what can I do positively, the opportunity within grief, to do something that feels like an affirmative assumption of responsibility and not internalize somehow that I failed in terms of not protecting my friend. Her friend is gone and her friend was taken away in the most horrific fashion possible. But what she did was say, what can I do in the light of that fact to fulfill responsibilities that make me feel that I have some control over determining what the future might mean for me, my people, my family, my kind. And I think in small, other ways, more mundane ways, we're all doing that in a certain sense when we're dealing with adversity and grief. We can internalize the sense that the responsibility shows all the ways that we're incapable and that we failed. Or we can recognize that surviving means that we have moments and opportunities at multiple junctures to provide something, give support, promote health, to encourage healing for oneself and ones around us. And in some ways, like flipping responsibility to a positive rather than an incapacitating sort of sense seems like it's part of it.
Amy,
So to your, and I.
Amy, we can't hear you. Yeah, thank you.
Yes, as a mom, I'm a grieving mom, I lost my son. So all of this, one of the things that I put forward in the community helpful resources. So being a part of something that helps other people. So that was my way of like taking it just a little bit. I do it in honor of my son, Miles Frazier. And that separates that feeling of, but the grief is going to always be there. And there's also that survivor's guilt that you go through, not getting protected. And then also some of the other things that come up to this process, like when you get so deep into your feelings, it's just a pity party or something. And your fine lines and all of that. But the real person I got is it's reaching out, doing something in the community, trying to make it different. That to me all the difference. So trying to find some resources for support. And that's the only thing I speak to. We need more of that in community. So I do learn from other universities. We need everything. And I think that's something can be.
And I'm struck, Amy, that, and this has been a really helpful conversation, I should say, for my own thinking, that, so many resources are now directed towards preventing violence, which is a good thing, right? But I think you could make an argument for comparable resources being invested in the aftermath of violence and the opportunity afforded by individual and collective grieving processes.
And then it's a good thing.
And then-
It not only helps the person.
Right, and I think the translation of that sense of powerlessness into a sense of agency is really critical.
Thank you. I've got Tobias and then Royce.
Hello, so I don't know if I have a question because I've been practicing the listening skills. I've just been listening and really thinking about the question. So maybe it's a prompt. But I guess what I'm thinking about is when we think about this idea of safety, do folks who experience the pressures of systemic racism in different communities on the South Side and North Side, do folks ever really feel a sense of safety? Or is it something else? Right? Because I wonder if the language we're using is not something that resonates. Because I think about I'm from Brooklyn, New York. I think about my own life and indeed feeling a sense of belonging, but I don't know if safety was a part of what it meant to feel a sense of belonging, which I think is interesting. And I think also feeling a sense of belonging, part of that is sort of being on in the end of life, right? Sort of knowing what violence feels like and knowing how grief and violence and can sort of like build camaraderie in communities, right? To where you sort of get to know people in a different way because of all the grief and experience. So I guess I'm just thinking about the language we're using around safety, and I'm thinking about belonging for Black folks in particular in communities that are, you know, affected by the pressures of systemic racism, and like if that language is even applicable.
Or all that useful.
Yeah.
You know, most students on this campus are comparatively insulated and protected from physical violence if you define it as general physical violence from a weapon. There are a whole set of other conversations to have about whether your body is safe, for instance, in relation to sexual violence. But, you know, something that's been talked about more and more is the degree of online aggression and the ways in which both from people close to oneself and people at a distance, there's a toxic, I think is the word that's used sort of generally, manner in which people are existing online in relation to their lives. And I think in that sense, students' lives are not that different from the lives of other people. In fact, the degree to which they are tapped into social media may mean that depending on generation, I mean, this is true for youth on the South Side as well, because of the ways in which, you know, beef is something that's often lived through social media. There's just a way in which, you know, I think what your point is that it's ambient and it's specific to different groups, but you had that question about somebody suggested what's the relationship of stories like the conflict in relation to Israel and Hamas that's impacting Gaza presently right now, on thinking about these questions. Violence is kind of all around us. As a historian, I think we forget in Chicago how deeply this society is founded in violence, the violence of capitalism, the violence of labor exploitation, the violence of settler colonialism, the violence of racism. And that's true in many different places as well. There's no simple answer to that, but what I think of, you know, from the standpoint of working within this council is we need to have a much richer conversation about who we are, how we relate to each other, and how critical it is that we're consulting one another's stories to think about this. To, you know, to kind of bring up one very basic point around this, the catchment of the medical center is very, very wide and incorporates, for instance, I believe, Auburn Gresham, certainly Englewood, and a number of communities that are not contiguous with the university. Catchment of the university as an institution and as a campus is much more narrow. One of the things we've talked about extensively within the council is maybe one of the recommendations that we need to make is to say the university needs to understand that the South Side, maybe the city, maybe a number of suburbs externally, this is all the neighborhood of this institution and this community. And until we recognize responsibility in that sort of way, it's going to be difficult to build firm enough boundaries to insulate ourselves away. Because as you say, I mean, people recognize that on a quotidian level, they don't need to necessarily feel safe because they understand all the forces that are extracting safety away from them. What they need to feel is that they have resources to address that fact.
Want to get Royce's
Can I
question,
just pull a thread, one more thread?
one more thread, and then I want to get to
Yeah,
the question.
That I really appreciate your comment, the prompt, and it will prompt me to do some thinking about the, you know, the limitations of those categories. I've conducted many interviews with our conversations with young people on the South Side, and have asked them how you go about being safe. You know, how do you get from home to school? And it actually, much more than asking people about violence, asking them about how they go about being safe, gets lots of granular detail about, you know, strategies. And what shocks me as, you know, a privileged white guy, you know, privileged in every possible way, is the loss of freedom that is represented in having to be hypervigilant as you move through the city You know, I could move through the city thinking about this conversation. I can go out and somebody else, a woman in a world of where predatory behavior by men is a constant threat, an African-American, a youth, name your category. That, I think we need to understand the terrible thing doesn't need to happen. The rape doesn't need to happen. The beat down by the police doesn't need to happen for there being a constant daily accruing loss of freedom.
Yeah.
And we don't really speak to that.
Yeah, it's the equivalent of a regressive tax
Yeah.
that someone deals with every moment of the day.
Royce, and then your question, and then we'll need to wrap.
Sorry, I'm wondering if this might be useful to think about. It's something I've been thinking about. So, you know, the question about self-pity was interesting. Increasingly, as a neuroscientist and psychiatrist, I'm very interested in self-deception. Not because I think it's interesting that people deceive each other, but I think it's so interesting that we just don't know the extent of it, which we think we do things, we think we're irrational actors, and so many interventions and ideas treat people as rational actors. But there's so much evidence that the reason we do things is completely different from what we're actually doing. So about gender, so, you know, a casual observer from another planet would say that seems to be somewhat of a race problem, but there seems to be some interesting thinking about gender, police violence, gun violence. It's not just men, but it's hard not to associate with this. So I guess the opportunity here would be, is there something interesting about that we're into, about this different perspectives of safety from a female, male, transgender perspective?
Yeah, certainly. I feel like this kind of ties well with this prompt that we have here, because safety is not a right and it is certainly a privilege, but often we're asking ourselves, you know, who is responsible for my safety? Is it me? Is it others? Is it the state? Is it you know, these concepts of safety differ vastly depending on the identities that you hold, right? And if I'm thinking about, you know, what the tools are for safety, I think we're thinking about these global connections, right? Like, I don't necessarily believe that some of these hyper surveillance tools are keeping me safe, but they are being marketed as safety, right? There is a disguised a package that is being called safety that might not mean safety for everybody who feels that or is under that kind of rule or law, or, you know, wherever that's coming from. I lost my train of thought. I'm sorry. I'll pass here.
I've got one comment to that, and then I wanted to make your question. Coming up in public discourse, the ending of school resource officers from Chicago Public Schools, I think, is actually an example of the way that the public is saying, the school resource officers do not keep us safe. Our children need counseling. Let's figure out a way to reposition the resources that are going here and to put into another space, because what's the issue of resources was mentioned there. We've got a last question and then we're going to wrap things up, please.
Yeah, thank you for having this work group. So I've lived in the community since about 2016, and I'm a member of Thresholds, and I don't receive any services from them I would consider quality. It's mostly able to make money off of me, and, you know, they can get to say for the Tribune they're a good workplace, but outside of that, you know, it's not helpful. Neither is Catholic Charities as an ethical organizations. They're much better, but recently I had a very unpleasant housing inspection. And so is there talk about investing money into mental health at all, or these spaces, or having a dialogue with embedded organizations like Thresholds, regardless also of race or gender? Thank you.
Thank you. From my recollection, it was part of the agenda that helped Mayor Brandon Johnson get into office. I also think that there have been a lot of things that have happened since he's come into office that unfortunately have put that agenda to some extent aside. But it's certainly something that I think is incredibly important, not just for this topic, but for the city as a whole. I've worked with a project called the Chicago Chronic Conditions Equity Network, in which we've gone and done community town halls to ask the question of what is needed in order to improve the health and well-being of people who live in your community. And it has not come up around things like high blood pressure, diabetes, the kinds of things that people typically think of. But mental health has been number 1, 2, and 3 in the town halls that we've done. And in particular, mental health and its responsiveness around the trauma that exists within our community. So I think that your point is very well taken.
My name is David Purcell. That's my interest.
Thank you so much, David. I think that we are at the end of our hour. I would like to thank our panelists today. Thank you so much for giving us. Our chair of the Trauma Interest Work Group was able to join us. Sonia, did you want to make
Yeah, I
a
just want
comment
to
or
say
two?
thank you all. Sorry, I was on a call with SAMHSA and not ironically, but it dovetail talking about writing something about the effects of community violence as it relates to gun violence on our youth and families. And here we're having a panel discussion about safety. So Trey, I'm going to take some of your stuff. I'm going to talk to you about that. I'm going to quote you if that's okay. But thank you all for coming. Please look out for more events coming from our work group. And if you're interested in being on the listserv, I don't know if we could put up a slide, if we have a housekeeping slide, but please join the work group to get more information about upcoming events. Yeah, thank you all for coming on this beautiful day. Amy, did you have something? Nope. I covered it all.
Thank you, thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. And thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much. I would like to meet you all. I mean, Trey, I know you formally, Jamie. But yes, thank you all for coming and taking this time out of your very busy day to talk about something incredibly important to our community.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.